Now we are going to discuss burns. So in burns, what are the indications of referral of the patient to a dedicated burn center? In which case we are supposed to refer a patient to a dedicated burn center. Suppose you are working at a PHC, primary health center, and there is a patient of burn. So in which cases you will refer this patient to dedicated burn center. So if a patient is having partial thickness burn involving more than 10% of body surface area, or patient is having full thickness burn, any full thickness burn. So see the indications of referral. Indications of referral to dedicated burn center. Dedicated burn center. Right? So first indication, partial thickness burn involving more than 10% of body surface area, or any full thickness burn. Any full thickness burn. Now suppose patient is having burns involving face, hands, foot, joints, genitalia. In this case also we are supposed to refer the patient. So burns involving face, hands, foot, joints and genitalia. Joints and genitalia. Okay. Now some patients are having electrical burn, certain patients are having chemical burn. If a patient is having burn with inhalational injury, in these cases also referral is required. So chemical burn, electrical burn, burn with inhalational injury, burn with inhalational injury, burn with trauma, and burn with comorbidities in elderly. Suppose there is an elderly patient and the patient is having comorbidities. So you know that in burn what happens? There is third space fluid loss. So if there is comorbidity, there is increased risk of complications. Clear? So burn with comorbidities in elderly, and burn in children requiring special emotional care. Burn in children requiring special emotional care. Clear? So these are the indications of referral to dedicated burn center. Right? Now see the pathophysiology of burn. What happens? There is integumentary loss, right? And there is radiant loss of fluid. What else is going to happen? There is release of inflammatory mediators, and because of this inflammatory mediators there is vasodilatation and increased capillary permeability, and because of this increased capillary permeability there is third space loss. Clear? And if there is third space loss, what's the problem? The fluid from vascular compartment goes to extravascular compartment. So these patients have hypovolemia. Second problem, there is global depression of immune function, and that's why these patients are prone to infections. The patients of burns are having fever even in absence of infection. Why? Because there is hypermetabolism. Why there is hypermetabolism? Because there is increased secretion of glucagon, increased secretion of corticosteroids, increased secretion of catecholamines. So increased secretion of catecholamines, glucagon and corticosteroids leads to hypermetabolism, and this hypermetabolism is also responsible for fever. We discussed it many times that there are stress ulcers in the patients of head injury and in patients of burns, right? So what is the name of those stress ulcers? One is Cushing ulcers and one is curling ulcer. Which one is seen in burns? So in burns we see this one, curling ulcers, right? So in all patients you are not going to find curling ulcers. In which patients you will find this? If the burn is involving more than 1/3 of body surface area. So when more than one third of body surface area is involved, there is curling ulcer. Now what is the problem? In burns there is hypovolemia, so there is decrease in defense factors, but acid production is normal. So here acid secretion, this acid secretion is normal. What happens in Cushing ulcers? Cushing ulcers, these are seen in head injury. Clear? It is seen in head injury patients, and here it is associated with increased acid secretion. Increased acid secretion. Clear? So these are the important points related to the pathophysiology in burns. Now see, what are the areas of cutaneous injury in burns? Suppose you are going to touch any hot object, right? In that case, sometimes what happens, at the point of touch there is black area, that is known as zone of coagulation, because here there is coagulative necrosis. Immediately surrounding the zone of coagulation there is zone of stasis, and around zone of stasis there is zone of hyperemia. So these are areas of cutaneous injury. So what you see in zone of coagulation, in the zone of coagulation, since the name is coagulation, so these patients have coagulative necrosis. Clear? And in zone of coagulation there is irreversible damage. Why? Because coagulative necrosis has occurred. Now you can see here there is an area immediately surrounding this zone of coagulation. So what is the name of this area? This is known as zone of stasis. And in this zone of stasis, what happens? There is moderate degree of insult. Moderate degree of insult, simultaneously there is decreased tissue perfusion. It means whatever the cells are there, these cells can survive or these cells can progress to coagulative necrosis. What you are supposed to remember, that in this zone of stasis there is moderate degree of insult, moderate degree of insult. Clear? An important point, there is decreased tissue perfusion. Clear? So here cells can survive or cells can progress to coagulative necrosis. You must be knowing that in patients of burn, what we use water for cooling of the burn wound. What is the ideal temperature of water? The ideal temperature of water should be 15 degrees centigrade. So we use this water for cooling of the burn wound. Now the problem, if you are using ice or cold water for cooling of this burn wound, what happens? Since there is decreased tissue perfusion in the zone of stasis, yes, there will be vasoconstriction, and if there is vasoconstriction, what will happen? It can lead to coagulative necrosis. So use of ice, use of cold water or chilled water increases the extent of injury. That's why for cooling of burn wound, what is the best temperature of water? 15 degrees centigrade. Now the third zone is zone of hyperemia. Hyperemia, so it suggests that in this zone there is vasodilatation. So what happens? There is vasodilatation. So in zone of hyperemia there is vasodilatation and viable cells are present in zone of hyperemia. So whatever healing occurs, it occurs or starts from zone of hyperemia. So here healing starts from this zone. So healing starts from zone of hyperemia. So these are areas of cutaneous injury in burn. After that, there is one question which is frequently asked in NEET and AIIMS, and that is burn classification. You know that the burn classification or degree of burn is based on the depth of burn. So suppose only epidermis is involved, so this is known as first degree of burn. The other name of this first degree of burn, since only epidermis is involved, this is epidermal burn. First degree is epidermal burn. Now you can see here in second degree, apart from epidermis, dermis is also involved. So this is partial thickness burn. This partial thickness burn is further divided into superficial partial thickness and deep partial thickness. In the superficial partial thickness, apart from epidermis, only papillary dermis is involved. And in deep partial thickness burn, there is involvement of reticular dermis. Now here, the important point is you can see subcutaneous fat, and you can see there is involvement of subcutaneous fat in which degree? Third degree of burn, and this is known as full thickness burn. Full thickness burn. Clear? After that, fourth degree, so just beneath skin there is muscle, sometimes there is bone, there is brain. So if there is involved, apart from skin, there is involvement of underlying muscle, bone or brain, and that is fourth degree burn. Clear? So we are going to discuss in detail the burn classification. So first of all, epidermal burn. Epidermal burn. So this is first degree burn, and it is known as epidermal burn. So which layer is involved? Only epidermis. So there is involvement of epidermis. Clear? It is very easy to remember the burns by examples. Now suppose in the morning we are ironing our clothes and accidentally we are going to touch that hot iron. Generally this part of forearm and hand is going to touch. So what happens? At the site of touch there is only a red line. It is painful or painless? Very painful. There is blisters or no blisters? No blisters. And it heals with scarring or without scarring? Without scarring. So this is first degree burn or epidermal burn. So first degree burn or epidermal burn, here only epidermis is involved. It's painful. It's erythematous. Erythematous. There is no blisters. So there are no blisters, and it heals without scarring. It heals without scarring, and in how many days? Within 5 to 10 days. Clear? So this is first degree or epidermal burn. After that there is second degree burn, and we discussed what is the name of second degree burn. It is also known as partial thickness burn. Partial thickness burn. Clear? This is further divided into superficial partial thickness and deep partial thickness. So see the types. It is further divided into superficial partial thickness burn and deep partial thickness burn. Clear? So in superficial partial thickness burn we discussed that it's going to involve what? Epidermis plus papillary dermis. Papillary dermis. Okay, how you are going to remember? By the example, suppose sometimes we are making tea or coffee and there is spillage of hot tea, hot coffee, hot milk or hot water, and whenever there is spillage of hot tea, hot milk, hot water, what happens? Sometimes you are going to notice that there is presence of blisters. It is painful or painless? It is painful. So partial thickness burn, superficial partial thickness burn, it is painful. There is presence of blisters. It heals with scarring or without scarring? Without scarring. And in how many days? 7 to 14 days. Clear? So the important points related to superficial partial thickness burn. So it's painful. There is presence of blisters, and healing occurs without scarring. Healing occurs without scarring within 7 to 14 days. Okay, we have this kind of burn. In deep partial thickness burn, there is involvement of epidermis plus reticular dermis, right? And if you have seen this kind of burn, you will notice that whatever the area which is burned, which is deep partial, having deep partial thickness burn, that area appears mottled, and there are whitish pinkish areas. There are no blisters, there is no pain, but pinprick sensation is preserved. And in this case, healing occurs with scarring. So in deep partial thickness burn, there is involvement of epidermis plus reticular dermis. Reticular dermis appearance, it's mottled. Clear? So it is having whitish and pinkish areas. So there is whitish and there are whitish and pinkish areas. There are no blisters, no pain, but pinprick sensation is preserved. Pinprick sensation. So pinprick sensation, it's preserved. Clear? And here healing occurs with scarring and it takes 3 to 9 weeks. So here healing occurs with scarring, and how much time? Generally 3 to 9 weeks. Now see the third degree burn. So what is the other name of this third degree burn? This is known as full thickness burn. This is full thickness burn. Clear? And this was the question which was asked in NEET. What was the straightforward question? Involvement of subcutaneous fat is seen in which type of burn? So in this case there is involvement of epidermis, dermis plus subcutaneous fat. So here there is involvement of epidermis plus dermis plus, you have to highlight because this is important, subcutaneous fat. Okay, if you have seen a full thickness burn patient, what happens? If the patient is having full thickness burn, what there is presence of leathery, black colored leathery eschar. Okay, if this leathery eschar is specially present in upper limb or lower limb and it is circumferential, so if there is circumferential leathery eschar, what's the problem? Yes, beneath the eschar there is extravasation of fluid, so edema. And if there is extravasation of fluid or edema beneath the eschar, what will happen? There is increased pressure in the compartment, and because of this increased pressure in the compartment, what will happen? There is compartment syndrome. So whenever a patient is having third degree burn, obviously we have to start the fluid resuscitation, but to prevent this compartment syndrome, what we have to perform? Escharotomy. Okay, so these third degree burn patients, they have black colored, black leathery eschar. Clear? And if this leathery eschar is circumferential, if it is circumferential, because of this circumferential eschar, there is increased risk of what? Compartment syndrome. Clear? And that's why we have to perform what? Escharotomy. Clear? Apart from fluid resuscitation, to prevent this complication, we have to perform escharotomy. Now, if you see the wound, generally the whole skin is burned, it's full thickness burn. That's why there is no pain, no blisters, no pinprick sensation. So there is no pain, no blisters, no pinprick sensation. And in this case, healing occurs with contracture. Have you seen any patient of contracture? If you go to the plastic surgery department, especially the OPD of plastic surgery, you will find the patients who are having this kind of, posture. So what? This is contracture. So how we are going to prevent the contracture? When patient is having third degree burn, we resuscitate the patient, and after resuscitating the patient, we take the patient to OT. And whatever the burn skin is there, we are going to perform the excision of burn skin, and we have to go for grafting. Clear? So important points related to this: there is no pain, no blisters, no pinprick sensation, no pinprick sensation. Clear? And here healing occurs with contracture. So here healing occurs with contracture. So how to prevent contracture? We have to go for excision of burnt skin, excision of burnt skin plus skin grafting. Skin grafting. Clear? So this is how we prevent the contracture. Otherwise healing occurs with contracture. Now see the fourth degree burn. So what happens in this fourth degree burn? Apart from skin, underlying structures are also involved. So here there is involvement of skin plus underlying structures. Underlying structures. Clear? So what are those structures which are involved? Muscle, bone or brain. So there is involvement of muscle, bone or brain. Clear? So you might have seen charred bodies, and in those bodies you have seen that the skin and underlying structure is charred. Or sometimes in some kind of accident, if a patient is alive but one limb is charred, in which the skin and underlying structures are involved. So these are the 4 degrees of burns which are frequently asked. So let's quickly revise the questions which are frequently asked. In epidermal burn, only epidermis is involved. So you will find that there is only erythema. There is only erythema, there is no blister, it is painful. So this is first degree, which layer epidermis is involved. Here you can see the second degree, in which epidermis as well as dermis both are involved. Clear? And in third degree, you notice that this subcutaneous fat is also involved. So these are the important points. After that, one-liners are frequently asked in NEET as well as in AIIMS, related to death in patients of burns. Suppose a patient was having burn and patient expired at the site of burn or at the site of accident. So if patient expired at the site of burn or accident, so what is the most common cause of death? It is the asphyxia. Suppose patient is brought to your hospital and patient died within 1 or 2 hours after arrival to the hospital. So what is the most common cause of early death in patients of burns? So the most common cause of early death is hypovolemia or shock. And what is the most common cause of late death, means after 7 to 10 days patient expired in the hospital? So it is sepsis. And overall, what is the most common cause of death in burns? Sepsis. Which organism is most commonly responsible for sepsis? It's the Pseudomonas. So these are one-liners. So first question, what is the most common cause of death at site of burn or at the site of accident? Clear? So these patients have inhalational injury, so they die because of asphyxia. Most common cause of early death. Most common cause of early death in burns, and that is hypovolemia or shock. It's hypovolemia or shock. Clear? Most common cause of late death, and that is what? Sepsis. Sepsis. Suppose nothing is mentioned and the question, overall most common cause of death in burns, sepsis. So overall most common cause of death overall, and that's sepsis. Clear? And what is the most common organism responsible for sepsis? It is Pseudomonas. It is Pseudomonas. Now see, whenever the patients of burns are brought to our emergency, we have to start the fluid resuscitation. Simultaneously, we have to assess or look for the danger signs of airway burns. This question was asked both in AIIMS and NEET. Danger signs of airway burns. Now see, if the burn is involving what? Face or head and neck, or if there is singed or burned nasal hair, or in the sputum there is presence of carbonaceous deposit, or patient is having what? Hoarseness of voice, or patient relatives gives history of burn in a closed room. So these are the danger signs of airway burns. So what are the danger signs of airway burns? Clear? So burns involving head and neck and face, singed or burned nasal hair, carbonaceous deposits in sputum, hoarseness of voice, history of burn in closed room. Now, whenever we are suspecting that this patient might have airway burns, what we have to go for? We have to go for elective intubation. So in patients of airway burns, elective intubation is safest. Why? Suppose you are not going for the intubation in a patient who is having airway burns, you started the fluid resuscitation. We have seen in emergencies that after 4 to 6 hours of fluid resuscitation, patients started developing what? Laryngeal edema. And because of this laryngeal edema, now if you attempt what? The intubation, the tracheal intubation is difficult. So in these patients, when there is already laryngeal edema, then we have to go for what? Cricothyroidotomy. Right? So for these patients who are having airway burns, what is safest? Elective intubation. Elective intubation, this is safest. Clear? And if patient is going to develop laryngeal edema, and if patient is having laryngeal edema, in that case we have to go for cricothyroidotomy. Clear? When patient is having laryngeal edema. Clear? So what is safest? Elective intubation is safest in the patients having airway burns. So let's discuss the management of burn patients. Management of burn patients. Right? So first important point, that in which patient of burn fluid resuscitation is required. We have to start fluid resuscitation. So all patients are not going to require fluid resuscitation. So in which patient fluid resuscitation is required? So see, first is fluid resuscitation. Right? So we discussed that there is third space loss, and because of that there is hypovolemia. So if patient is a child, so in children, if there is involvement of more than 10% of total body surface area, and if in adults there is involvement of more than 15% of total body surface area, in these patients there is risk of hypovolemia. And if there is risk of hypovolemia, what we have to go for? Yes, we have to go for resuscitation. So in which patient fluid resuscitation? Children involving more than 10% of body surface area, and in adults more than 15%. Right? So first we have to select the venous access. See, generally for fluid resuscitation, upper limb is preferred over lower limb, and in upper limb, veins in the hand, antecubital fossa, these are used. So first principle, veins of upper limb are preferred over lower limb, and veins in hand or antecubital fossa is used. Now you have seen that certain patients who are having burns and there is massive edema in upper limb. So if there is massive edema in upper limb, what we have to choose? We have to choose the lower limb, and in lower limb we go for venous cut down. Now for resuscitation we have two options if upper limb veins are not accessible. One, central line insertion, and second is venous cut down. Which one is preferred? Venous cut down is preferred over central line insertion. Okay, so for fluid resuscitation, venous access. Clear? So it's very easy to remember. First, upper limb is preferred over lower limb, and in upper limb we are using veins of hand and veins in antecubital fossa. Antecubital fossa. Clear? If upper limb veins are not accessible, in lower limb we prefer venous cut down. So in long saphenous we perform venous cut down, and this venous cut down is preferred over central line insertion. Central line insertion. Clear? Simple questions. Now venous access is restored, then we should start the fluid resuscitation. What is the fluid of choice for resuscitation? So fluid of choice in burns is ringer lactate. Very, very important point. Fluid of choice in burns is ringer lactate. Right? And we discussed in hypertrophic pyloric stenosis and patients who are having gastric outlet obstruction, in these patients what is the fluid of choice? Normal saline. So if a patient is having, you have to remember, it's important, hypertrophic pyloric stenosis or gastric outlet obstruction, we discussed that it is normal saline. Okay, now see, there was one question in Maharashtra and most of the students marked the wrong answer. What was the question? See, maintenance fluid of choice in burns in children. Maintenance fluid of choice in burns in children. And see, first option was ringer lactate and most of the students marked ringer lactate. The students who were knowing the answer that fluid of choice in burns is ringer lactate, they only saw this much. Okay, so when you remember the answer and you are not going to read all four options, what you are very prone to do the mistake. So here, if you are just looking this statement, fluid of choice in burns, then the answer is ringer lactate. But this is the question, maintenance fluid of choice in burns in children. In children, the glycogen reserve is very small. That's why we have to supplement dextrose. And since we have to supplement dextrose, the maintenance fluid of choice is DNS. It is the dextrose normal saline. So read the question carefully. Apart from ringer lactate, what are the other fluids which can be used for resuscitation? The other fluids which can be used, so we can use normal saline, we can use hypertonic saline, we can use fresh frozen plasma, we can use albumin, human albumin. Okay, now there is one condition known as burn shock. See, patient is in the state of hypovolemia. You started the fluid and you started giving crystalloids, which one? Ringer lactate. Despite of giving crystalloids, when there is no improvement in the patient overall status, there is no improvement in blood pressure, so obviously there is no adequate perfusion. This situation is burn shock. So in this particular condition, you have to give which fluid? After crystalloids, which fluid should be given? The fluids which are having high oncotic pressure, so that these fluids are going to retain in the vascular compartment. So for burn shock, we give hypertonic saline. Why? Because hypertonic saline is having high oncotic pressure, so it will be retained in the vascular compartment. So we started the resuscitation. Simultaneously, we have to calculate that how much is the required fluid for this patient, and what is the most commonly used formula. We use Parkland formula. Parkland formula. This is most commonly used and most commonly asked. This Parkland formula is crystalloid based. It's first important point. It's crystalloid based. Clear? And what is this formula? The fluid required for 24 hours. So this timing is calculated since the time of burn. Timing is calculated since the time of burn. And here, for fluid resuscitation, first degree burns are not included. Clear? So what is the formula? 24 hours fluid required is, it is 4 ml into body weight in kg, 4 ml into body weight in kg into percentage of burnt surface area. Burnt surface area. Clear? Now imagine if a patient is having 70% burn, or if a patient is having 80% burns, how much is the fluid which should be given? So the maximum fluid given to any patient irrespective of burn is calculated according to 50% of burns. Because if you are going to calculate it more than 50, then it can lead to fluid overload. So three important points. Time is calculated since the time of burn. First degree burns are not included for the fluid resuscitation, and the maximum fluid is given. It should be calculated according to 50% of burns. Okay, let's discuss it with one example. Suppose there is a female patient whose weight is 50 kg and she is having 50% burns. So how much is the fluid required? So how much is the 24 hours fluid requirement? So here you can see it's 4 ml into 50 kg body weight into 50. Some students are doing this mistake. They put 100 also. No, don't do this. Only 50%. So this is how much? This is 10,000 ml. It means 10 liters. Clear? So this 10 liters is for 24 hours. So half of the required fluid is given in first 8 hours and rest half is given in next 16 hours. So whatever the calculated fluid is there, half of the fluid is given in first 8 hours. And rest half, this is given in next 16 hours. Simple. Now see, once in DNB this question was asked, that what is the second day fluid requirement? This is the first day requirement. What is the second day fluid requirement? And the second day fluid requirement is 40 to 60% of first day fluid requirement. So very important, you have to remember what is the second day fluid requirement, and this is 40 to 60% of first day. And if you take the average, how much? It's 50%. It means if we see how much fluid should be given in first 8 hours, how much fluid should be given in next 16 hours, and how much fluid should be given in next 24 hours. So if the amount of fluid given in first 8 hours is X, amount in next 16 hours, amount of fluid given in next 16 hours will also be X, and next 24 hours will also be X. Let's calculate. Here you saw that the 10 liter was the fluid requirement for 24 hours. Half of the fluid should be given in first 8 hours, so 5 liters. Rest half is given in next 16 hours, so 5 liters. And the second day fluid requirement is half of the first day. So how much is given in next day or second day? 5 liters. Clear? So these are the important points. Now there is ATLS modification of Parkland formula. Problem: if in the question nothing is mentioned, only fluid resuscitation required fluid is asked, you will use this traditional Parkland in which 4 ml per kg formula should be used. But in the question, if it's specifically mentioned that according to ATLS modification how much fluid should be given, then you have to use this formula. So see, what's the ATLS modification? ATLS modification of fluid resuscitation. So first, this ATLS modification, it's based on age, it is based on weight, and it is based on type of injury. Type of injury. Clear? Now see, if the patient is an adult or a child whose age is more than equal to 14 years. So if there is an adult patient or children age more than 14 years. Clear? So for this group, at the place of 4 ml per kg, we give 2 ml per kg. So the formula is 2 ml into body weight in kg into percentage of burnt surface area. Percentage of total burnt surface area. And if the age of child is less than 14 years, so children less than 14 years, or child body weight less than equal to 30 kg. So in this category, how much fluid is given? It is 3 ml into body weight into kg into total burnt surface area. Now see, doesn't matter what is the age of patient, what is the weight of patient. If there is electrical injury or electrical burn, so in cases of electrical burn or electrical injury, what we follow? 4 ml into body weight in kg into total burnt surface area, percentage of total burnt surface area. So you have to remember and you have to read the question carefully. If ATLS modification is mentioned, then use this formula. So this is the table of ATLS modification. Here you can see if the patient is having flame or scald in adults and older children more than equal to 14 years of age, we give 2 ml per kg body weight into per percentage of total burnt surface area. Less than 14 years or body weight less than equal to 30 kg, so we give what? 3 ml per kg. And in children we have to supplement it with dextrose. So what was the maintenance fluid of choice? Dextrose normal saline, because the glycogen reserve is less. And electrical injury in all ages, we give what? 4 ml per kg body weight into per percentage of total burn surface area till urine clears. Clear? So this is ATLS modification. So we saw that in Parkland we only give crystalloid. So Parkland was crystalloid based formula. There is Brook formula which is both crystalloid and colloid based. So Brook formula. In Brook formula we give both crystalloids and colloids. Clear? So how much? In this we give crystalloids and colloids. Clear? So see the formula. The fluid requirement is it's 1.5 ml per kg body weight per percentage of total burned surface area of crystalloids. Clear? Plus 0.5 ml per kg. 0.5 ml per kg per percentage of total burned surface area of colloids plus 2 liters of free water. 2 liters of free water. Clear? So this is Brook formula. There is a pediatric formula and the names are asked in exam. It's the Galveston formula. So for pediatric patients we use Galveston formula. So this is for pediatric patients. Now in Parkland and Brook we are using the percentage of burnt surface area, but in Galveston we are using the burnt surface area in meter square. Clear? So in Galveston formula the fluid requirement is, see here, it's 5000 ml. Why? Because we are using meter square. The burnt surface area is calculated in meter square. Per meter square of total burnt surface area. Total burnt surface area plus 1500 ml per meter square of total body surface area. So here, clear? 5000 ml per meter square of total burnt surface area plus 1500 ml per meter square of total body surface area. You must be knowing how much is the body surface area in a human adult. It's 1.73. Clear? So this is the Galveston formula. So we start the fluid resuscitation. Simultaneously we have to monitor the fluid resuscitation. So see how we do the monitoring of fluid resuscitation. So monitoring of fluid resuscitation. One question which is asked almost every year in NEET or AIIMS, and that is best clinical indicator of tissue perfusion, and that is urine output. How much should be the minimum urine output after adequate tissue perfusion? In adults it's 1 ml per minute and in children it's 0.5 to 1 ml per minute. Okay, so what's the best clinical indicator? Best clinical indicator of tissue perfusion, right? And that is urine output. It's the urine output. Clear? So after adequate tissue perfusion, how much should be the minimum urine output? Minimum urine output in adults and in children. So after adequate tissue perfusion, the minimum urine output in adults should be, you have to remember, 1 ml per minute, and in children it's 0.5 to 1 ml per minute. Clear? Sometimes this value is given in R, and you can easily calculate if the value is given in R. 60 ml per hour in adults and 30 to 60 ml per hour in children. Now imagine if a patient is having cardiac dysfunction. If the patient is having cardiac dysfunction, in that case how we do the monitoring? We perform transesophageal ultrasound and bicentral line. So if a patient is having cardiac dysfunction, clear? So it is performed, monitoring is done by transesophageal ultrasound or via central line. So we go for CVP monitoring. Clear? So these are the questions related to monitoring. So since the calculation of fluid is based on burn surface area, so we have to go for estimation of burn surface area. And see, determination of burn size estimates the extent of injury. Determination of burn size estimates the extent of injury. And generally, which formula we use? We use the rule of 9, and this rule of 9 was given by Alfred Russel Wallace. Okay, so see how we estimate the burn surface area. We use rule of 9, and it was given by Alfred Russel Wallace. Now first see, what is the rule of 9? If you see, this head and neck is 9%, upper limb is 9%, lower limb is 18%, front of chest and abdomen is 18%, and back is 18%. Nowadays in exams, they started asking questions that if in upper limb only anterior part is involved, so how much is this? This is 4.5 and the posterior is 4.5. If we only see the chest, it is 9%, and if we see the abdomen, it is 9%, right? So see here, this head and neck, it is 9%, anterior is 4.5, posterior is 4.5. If you see both upper limb, these are 9%, anterior is 4.5, posterior is 4.5. If you see both lower limbs, it is 18%, anterior is 9, posterior is 9. If you see only chest, it is 9, abdomen is 9, so total anteriorly it's 18 and posteriorly it's 18, means back, upper back and lower back. And for genitalia, it's 1%. Clear? So this is 9% for adults. See, 9% rule or rule of 9 is not very accurate in children. By the way, see, in children, this head and neck is how much? 18%. Upper limb is 9, lower limb is 14%, right? And rest is same. What? Front of chest and abdomen 18 and back is 18. So upper limb is same, front of chest, abdomen is same, back is same. Different is this one. Here in head and neck there is 18%, and in lower limb what? There is 14%. Clear? So since rule of 9 is not very accurate for children, in AIIMS this question was asked that which one is highly accurate or most accurate for estimation of burn size in children, and that is Lund and Browder chart. So Lund and Browder chart, this was asked in AIIMS. Clear? It's most accurate for estimation of burn size in children. There is another formula which is used for children, and that is Burko's formula. Another formula which is used in children, that is Burko's formula, but the most accurate is Lund and Browder chart. Okay. Now see, there is one practical problem. What? You will not get an ideal patient in which whole head and neck is involved, or whole upper limb is involved, or whole lower limb is involved. Generally the patients of burn are having patchy burns, means some area of head and neck, some area of back, some area of chest or upper limb is involved. In this case, it is very difficult to calculate the exact percentage of burns, and for mixed distribution of burns we are going to use which method? Palmer method or rule of Palm. So we use Palmer method or rule of Palm. Now see how we are going to calculate. We have to put the hand of patient on a piece of paper, and then we are going to cut that piece of paper according to the shape of hand, and we are using that piece of paper for measuring that which body surface area is involved, and that is considered how much? 1%. So in this Palmer method, the area under palm and extended fingers is included, and this corresponds to 1% of body surface area. So this is Palmer method. Palmer method. It is also known as rule of Palm. Rule of Palm. See, the name is rule of Palm, but the area included is area of palm and of extended fingers. So this whole area is included and it corresponds to 1% of total body surface area. So generally for which kind of burns this Palmer method or rule of palm is used? It is used for splash burns and mixed distribution of burns. So this is used for splash burns and mixed distribution of burns. Clear? This question was also asked in All India. Now see how we take care of the burn wound. Whenever patient is having burns, what generally we advise that whenever you are having burn, you have to cool the burn wound. See, whenever you are having burn, what you do, generally you put your hand in the water, right? Why? And the moment you're putting your hand in the water, you are going to have some relief in the pain also. Why? Because cooling of burn wound provides analgesia and it slows the delayed microvascular damage. So how we take care of burn wound? First, cooling off or cool the burn wound. Cool the burn wound, right? So cooling, it provides analgesia and it delays the microvascular damage. Important point. What is the best temperature of water used for cooling? The best temperature is 15 degrees centigrade. We can use tap water also. We can use tap water. But you should not use chilled water, cold water or ice, because we discussed that there was in cutaneous injury, there was zone of stasis in which there is decreased perfusion. So if you use chilled water, cold water, ice, there is vasoconstriction and it will increase the extent of damage. One. Second, the cooling should be done minimum for 10 minutes. This cooling of burn wound should be done for minimum 10 minutes. And for how long it is effective? It is effective up to 1 hour after burns. So this is effective, cooling is effective up to 1 hour after burns. Second, you have seen that patients are having superficial partial thickness burn. Why? Because there is spillage of hot liquid, right? And when there is superficial partial thickness burn, generally in this case, what you have seen in household that the family members are going to apply Bernol, means whatever the antimicrobial is available, they are going to apply that. Even dressing is not done. So this method is known as exposure method and it is used for superficial partial thickness burn. So if a patient is having superficial partial thickness burn, yes, we can apply antimicrobials without dressing. Apply antimicrobials without dressing. Clear? And this is known as exposure method. We discussed that in superficial partial thickness burn, healing occurs without scarring within 7 to 14 days. So within 2 weeks, healing occurs without scarring. Third problem related to burns is eschar. So we go for escharotomy. And we discussed for which patient we go for escharotomy if the patient is having circumferential eschar. Clear? So how we perform escharotomy? We give incision over skin, superficial fascia and deep fascia. So this escharotomy is done for circumferential eschar. It's done for circumferential eschar. Clear? And we give longitudinal incision over skin, superficial fascia and deep fascia. So this is how we take care of burn wound. There are two methods of management of burn wound. One is known as exposure method and one is known as closed method. Okay, so what is exposure method? See, if there is burn wound and you just apply antimicrobials and you are not going to apply any dressing, so here the wound is exposed. This is exposure method. Okay, generally it is used in head and face. And what happens in closed method? In closed method we apply what? We apply the antimicrobials and after that occlusive dressing is applied. So this is what closed method, right? So see, what are the methods used for management of burn wound? First is exposure method, and second is closed method. So how to remember? In exposure method, the burn wound is exposed, and in closed method, it is covered or closed with dressing. So in exposure method, here no dressing is applied. So no dressing is applied, and we are using antimicrobials, and these antimicrobials are applied 2 to 3 times per day. So antimicrobials are applied 2 to 3 times per day. So question, generally it is used for burns of what? Face and head. So it is used for burns of face and head. Why? Because actually it's very difficult to apply dressing in these areas. Now what are the disadvantages? In exposure method, the wound is exposed, so because of this there is increased pain, there is increased heat loss, and since it is open, what is the problem? There is risk of cross contamination. So disadvantages: there is increased pain and increased heat loss. Clear? And there is increased risk of cross contamination. Okay, simple. What happens in closed method? Here occlusive dressing is applied. So here occlusive dressing is applied apart from means or antimicrobial agent. So first we apply antimicrobial agent and then dressing. Clear? We have to be very careful. Why? Because we have to change dressing twice daily. If you're not going to change the dressing twice daily, what is the problem? There is increased bacterial growth. So here dressing is changed. It's changed twice daily. Clear? So whatever the disadvantages are there in exposure method, yes, those are advantages in closed method. Means in exposure method there is increased pain and heat loss. So these are advantages. What are the advantages? Just opposite. There is decreased pain and decreased heat loss. Clear? And there is decreased risk of cross contamination. The only problem, there is increased bacterial growth if dressing is not changed twice daily. Then in PGI Chandigarh, this question was asked that in patients of burns, which antimicrobials are preferred? Topical antimicrobials or systemic antimicrobials? So generally in burn patients, topical antimicrobials are preferred. Which topical antimicrobials are commonly used in burns? See, the topical antimicrobials used. Topical antimicrobials used in burns. So these are the 4 agents which are commonly used. First is, most commonly used is 1% silver sulfadizine. 1% silver sulfadizine. Okay. Then there is 0.5% silver nitrate. 0.5% silver nitrate. Third is 5% mafenide acetate. 5% mafenide acetate. And fourth is combination of silver sulfadizine and cerium nitrate. So combination of silver sulfadizine plus cerium nitrate. Clear? Okay. Now see first 1% silver sulfadizine. So it provides broad spectrum antimicrobial prophylaxis against Pseudomonas and MRSA, right? So it provides broad spectrum antimicrobial prophylaxis against Pseudomonas, clear, and MRSA. Simple. What is the use of this 0.5% silver nitrate? It is highly effective against Pseudomonas colonization, right? So this is highly effective against Pseudomonas colonization. Okay, but what is the problem if the person is applying silver nitrate and this silver nitrate comes in the contact with furnitures? What? This silver nitrate is going to cause black staining of furniture. So it leads to black staining. This is the problem. Black staining of furnitures. Clear? Now this 5% mefenide acetate. This 5% mefenide acetate is generally used in USA. What is the problem? It's painful to apply. It's painful to apply, and the second problem, it is associated with metabolic acidosis. So this is associated with metabolic acidosis. Clear? Now see silver sulfadiazine and cerium nitrate. Okay, this is used in full thickness burn. What is the advantage of cerium nitrate and silver sulfadiazine combination? That this is going to have hardening effect over burn wound. So what's the problem? Over burnt skin, there is hardening effect. So it is used in full thickness burn. There is hardening effect over burnt skin, right? Generally, we are using this combination in elderly. Why? We discussed in the pathophysiology of burns that there is global depression of immunity in burns. And what happens? This silver sulfadiazine plus cerium nitrate combination, especially cerium nitrate, it depresses the cell-mediated immunosuppression. So it is used in elderly. Why? Because it depresses cell-mediated immunosuppression. Clear? So these are the 4 topical antimicrobial agents used in burns. So lots of questions are asked about dressing materials. Okay, first see alginate. Alginate. This alginate is absorptive but non-adherent. So this is absorptive but it's non-adherent. Okay. So there is a simple logic in dressing materials that if the dressing material is absorptive, it is used in high drainage wound and not used in non-draining wounds, right? So since it is absorptive, it is used in high drainage wounds. Simple. Okay. Similarly, foam is there. Foam is also absorptive. So the foam, this foam is also absorptive. Clear? And since it is absorptive, it is also used in high drainage wounds and it is not used in non-draining wound. So this is contraindicated in non-draining wounds. Simple. Third is hydrocolloid. What is the advantage of hydrocolloid? Hydrocolloid is going to cause autolytic debridement, but it is non-absorptive. So if it is going to cause autolytic debridement, you have seen certain patients which are admitted in surgery ward, bedridden, having quadriplegia. So these bedridden patients, they have increased risk of pressure sore, bed sore. So if there is pressure sore or bed sore, you have seen that there is presence of slough, and in those cases this hydrocolloid is used. So hydrocolloid, it facilitates autolytic debridement, and because of this autolytic debridement, this is used in stasis ulcers or bed sores. So it is used in bed sores, stasis ulcers. Why? Because there is presence of slough, and this is non-absorptive, and if it is non-absorptive, this is not used in high drainage wounds. Next is hydrogel. Hydrogel, the name is hydrogel, means it is going to hydrate the wound environment. Simultaneously, it also causes autolytic debridement. But problem, sometimes because of overhydration, hydrogel can macerate the wound, right? So the next is hydrogel. So how to remember? It hydrates the wound. Clear? So it rehydrates wound bed. And because of rehydration of wound bed, sometimes it can cause maceration because of overhydration, and it also causes autolytic debridement. We use transparent film also, and this transparent film is also having the property of autolytic debridement, but this is not having property of absorption, so this is non-absorptive. So next is transparent film. Clear? So this is also having property of autolytic debridement. Clear? But it is non-absorptive, and since it is non-absorptive, this is not used in high drainage wounds. So these are the dressing materials which are commonly asked in exams. After that, sometimes the questions are asked in forensic as well as in surgery related to chemical burns. See, when we were in class 11th and class 12th, and generally in chemistry lab, sometimes there is accidental spillage of acetic acid, H2SO4 means sulfuric acid, or hydrochloric acid. Okay, and what happens whenever these kind of chemical injury is going to occur? Suppose there is acidic injury, you are not going to neutralize acid with alkali, or you are having injury of alkali and you are not supposed to put the acid. Why? Because if you will try to neutralize acid with alkali, this reaction is exothermic, and this reaction itself is going to increase the extent of injury. Right? So whenever we are having chemical burn, the first step is what? We have to wash that area, or we have to go for copious irrigation with water and saline. Whatever the clothings, jewelry, ornaments are there, you have to remove that. Why? Because there is evidence of that chemical. Now we are going to discuss the chemical burn. See, when we were in class 11th or 12th, sometimes you have noticed or you have heard that there was accidental spillage of acetic acid, sulfuric acid, or hydrochloric acid on some student's body, and because of that there is burn. So whenever these kind of chemical burns are going to occur, you are not supposed to neutralize the burn. Means if there is acidic injury, you are not supposed to put the alkali. Why? Because this reaction is exothermic, which can increase the extent of injury. So first step you have to start the irrigation. So copious irrigation with saline or water. Whatever the contaminated clothes and jewelries are there, it should be removed. So see how we manage chemical burns. Management of chemical burns. Okay, the first step is copious irrigation with water or saline. With water or saline. But see, there are certain exceptions. If you are using water for elemental metals, this reaction is exothermic. So the exceptions are elemental metals and phenol. If you are using water with phenol, it is going to increase the extent and deeper infiltration of tissues. So what are the exceptions where water should be not used? First is elemental metals, because there is exothermic reaction with water. Elemental metals. And the second is phenol. Why? Because it can lead to deeper infiltration of tissues. Okay. Second thing is, the treatment should be continued until the pH becomes normal. So continue the treatment until pH becomes normal. pH becomes normal. Whatever the contaminated clothing and jewelry should be there, it should be removed. So remove contaminated clothing and jewelry. Clear? And the most important point, do not neutralize the burn. Means if there is acidic injury, don't put alkali, or vice versa. Do not try to neutralize. After that, questions are asked related to electrical injury. In electrical injury, there is DC means direct current injury and AC means alternating current injury. So electricity flows in the form of AC, alternating current, and whenever we are putting some kind of plug and we are using some kind of electrical appliances, in appliances direct current is there. So direct current DC injury is also known as electrical appliance injury, right? You have seen that sometimes when we are using hot iron or some kind of appliances and the wire is having some kind of cut, what we have some kind of altered sensation, and suddenly we are going to touch that wire and remove our finger. In direct current, there is very high resistance, so extensive tissue damage is not there, but what happens, there is burn at the site of entry and exit. So generally we are going to touch these appliances by the fingers, so you will notice that there is deep burn, small deep burn at the site of entry means in the finger, and there is burn at the site of exit means in the toes. So generally you will notice there is presence of small burn in the fingers and in the toes in cases of DC direct current injury. Sometimes there is injury to tendon, nerves. What is the problem with AC, alternating current? This alternating current is going to create a state of tetany. So that's why you have seen in the movies, in some kind of serials, that if the person is going to touch the wire, what happens? Person starts moving like this, and the person is not able to detach himself or herself from that exposed wire. In this case, if the other family members are also trying to remove that person, they are also going to be stuck there. So that's why how to prevent this kind of thing. If somebody is having this kind of injury, first we have to switch off the main power, right? Now the problem related to alternating current. When alternating current passes from our body, it interferes the cardiac pacing. There is no significant myocardial damage, but what? It is going to alter the cardiac pacing. That's why you have noticed that whenever any patient of electrical injury is brought to our emergency, what we do? We perform the ECG. Right? So see, electrical injury. First, direct current, DC, direct current injury. It is also known as electrical appliance injury. Electrical appliance injury. Clear? Here what happens? It is not having enough energy to cause extensive tissue destruction. Here there is very high resistance, and because of this very high resistance, there is small deep burn. Small deep burn. And where is this deep burn? At the site of entry and exit. Okay. So generally, where is the entry and where is the exit? We are going to touch it with fingers. So in fingers and in the toes. Simple. It can also lead to damage of tendon and nerves, but that's not very significant. Now see AC injury, alternating current injury. First problem, it creates a state of tetany, and because of this tetany, patient is not able to detach himself or herself. So what we have to do first? Switch off the power. Clear? Otherwise, you will also be stuck if you are going to detach that person. Second, it interferes with cardiac pacing. Interferes with normal cardiac pacing. Okay. But without significant myocardial damage. And that's why you have noticed that in emergency, for the patients of electrical injury, what we perform? ECG.